we're going to use an app and try to do meetups and try to organize just to set the table for the possibility of a party. Not that Sublation Media is not going to be a party, but we're the proto party. We're going to be doing correspondence and setting up conversations and holding meetings where we'll discuss what would be necessary.
Right.
For
and we all know,
journey.
right, that if that gets going and it gets big enough, that agents of the state will start to join it for the purposes of causing trouble inside it, right? We all know this. And we know that if it gets big enough and it tries to field new candidates, that there will be this demand from the state that it hold primaries, right? There are mechanisms that will be used if it gets going to try to cause trouble in it. And so when we build organizations, we have to constantly build ways of resisting these obstacles, right? And even within media organizations, there's this demand that you be market viable, that you make enough money that you can pay your bills. And Sublation Media only makes so much money, so it can only be so big, and the only ways that it could get bigger would be to become dumber and worse, right? At a certain point, you could do what Vaush does, but then it would be dumber and worse, and it wouldn't be useful anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So there are things that happen that constrain the size of these organizations, and the bigger you get and the more that you actually are able to do things, the harder the thing tries to create divisions in you, to replicate the divisions in you which exist in all of the other parts of society, right? This spiraling division that's being created everywhere, it tries to create these divisions within you. So if you don't have some way of stopping these agents of the state or these outside agitators or whatever we want to call them from coming in and making a mess of things, if you don't have rules of some kind to stop that from happening, then they'll take over your organization and destroy it. And all Marcuse is saying is that you can't let these people do that.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Benjamin Studebaker is back on the podcast today. Ben and I spent a lot of time together at the Republican convention. I'd say we became friends, and I'm glad to talk to you again today, Ben. While we were in Milwaukee, you talked to me about your appearance on Katie Halper's show with Matt Taibbi. It was a few years back, around the time he had written a scathing review of Marcuse overall. I think he had read One Dimensional Man and then this essay on repressive tolerance. I am like an ideologically committed fan of Matt Taibbi's. So I immediately responded, I got my back went up. How dare you critique the master? But I went and I looked at your conversation with Taibbi, and I thought I'd have you on to discuss that conversation and also your views of Marcuse about and what you think about repressive tolerance. I might run a few clips from that podcast, put those in later. But how would you characterize Taibbi's critique of Marcuse and your critique of his critique? Start there.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and I do agree. I do think we became friends in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
So Matt was reading Marcuse, I think, the way a lot of people read the Frankfurt School, which is out of context. He was coming back to them and trying to read them as an antecedent of stuff that came after. So he's looking at them as if they're a kind of paleo version of something that exists now. And I think that generally, if you want to understand them imminently, it's more effective to read the stuff that they read, the stuff that came before them, and the stuff that they were responding to. Because he didn't read a lot of that stuff, he didn't understand the way that Frankfurt School theorists like Marcuse took society and the state to have changed over the course of the first half of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And without that context, I don't think he could really understand what was being said, at least not on its own terms. So, any theorist you can read eminently to try to understand their intentions, how they were viewing the world within their own context. You can read in terms of their action. You can look at what did they do if they were politically active. And you could look at their reception, how they're received. You can look at just what's in the text and what can be done with it, what possibilities it opens up. There's lots of interesting ways to read people. I don't think that there's any kind of law or rule that you must read people eminently exclusively, that's the only way that you can or should read people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that imminent readings have to at least be acknowledged. And if you're not going to do an imminent reading, you need to go, okay, this may have meant different things to this person in that time and place. Nonetheless, I think the effect of what they said was blah, blah, blah. And what bothered me in that discussion is that I felt like Matt just didn't really care about Marcuse's intentions or about what it imminently meant or about the history. The sense I got in that discussion was that it just didn't really matter to him. He was much more interested in trying to use a reading of Marcuse to push people to the right.
Well, I watched it and I definitely do agree with you that he didn't seem to take up your critique fully. In other words, while he granted you your reading fully, like he said, oh yes, that's true, I'm sure you're right. And I kind of, sometimes I think he would say something like, yeah, I kind of knew that, or but what he wanted to hold on to was a critique of the contemporary left, that, and pointing to Marcuse's excesses, he wanted to be able to condemn the woke left or the cancel culture left or the practices of the contemporary left. I don't know if that amounts to wanting to push people to the right, although it is confusing in this moment just what it means to push people to the right. Going to the Republican convention, talking to people there, talking to the Never Trumpers there, and also talking to people who were Trump supporters. It was not. It's no longer so clear to me who gets to grab the mantle of the left anymore. But if we just assume that Taibbi wanted to push people away from the Democrats, and that counts as a way pushing them to the right, I guess I would agree, especially if you think the only alternative, and possibly Matt Taibbi thinks the only alternative, is Trump. But that seems to me there's like two different questions here. Like, what did his critique mean in this political moment? What was it being used for by Taibbi? And the other question is, like, what did Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance mean? What was his notion of one-dimensional man about? And what was its meaning then? And is there a reason to critique Marcuse specifically, from my perspective, around his ideas of repressive tolerance? So let's start with that. Let's start with Marcuse, and then we'll get back to Taibbi, which is, do you think, would I be misreading Marcuse if I were to say that what he wanted to do was encourage the aspects of the administrative state that the left had some sway over to use, like, hate speech laws and other forms of censorship or repression to contain and repress reactionary speech and ideas in his day? Would that be a misinterpretation of Marcuse's repressive tolerance essay? I mean, I know it's not the full extent of it, and it doesn't include the justifications for whatever he did claim, but would I be wrong to think that was what he was advocating for?
I would frame it less about trying to use the administrators and more about trying to defend society. I think from the point of view of the theorists of the Frankfurt School, in the 30s, you get this total state, which has colonized the life world. It has gotten its claws into society and is constituting, or at the very least appearing to constitute, subjects in such a way that they think they have freely come to identify with it, agree with it. So their objective is to defend this space of free society where they think that you have autonomous agency and the ability to actually choose your own values, develop your own view, from this false ersatz society, which is a captured society that belongs to a totalitarian state. And for them, fascist states, the Soviet Union, and New Deal style Anglo-American Keynesian states are all total states. They all exercise a kind of totalizing control over subjectivity and over society. So for him, there's a need to find some way of resisting this, to find some way of turning the kind of person that that state makes into someone who can enact a revolution or get out from under that subjectivity and that constitution. And that means having to, you can't trust the appearance of the free society that the total structure gives you, because it's no longer a free society. It's no longer the kind of society that would have existed in the 19th century, or perhaps maybe even as late as Weimar, depending on precisely how you would want to read it. So I think that that's the key thing. It's not so much trying to use the administrators to fight fascism. I think it's more broadly trying to use our ability to control the organizations that we are in to create spaces in society from which we can attempt to resist the colonization of the life world by the state.
Okay, I have an anecdote. When I was protesting the invasion of Iraq 20 years ago or so, I was, I had the bullhorn and I was giving rousing pep talk to the troops and saying, we can stop this war. And someone from the street who was heckling us was heckling me. And I decided to turn to him and say, listen, here's the bullhorn. This is a public street. If you have something to say, we can hear it. So then he stood up and he gave a defense of the invasion of Iraq and, smeared the character of the Iraqi people and of Arab people and so forth for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then I said, thank you, shook his hand and took the bullhorn again. That was me representing a civil society organization, not an NGO or anything. We were just a group of volunteers who had organized in a coalition to fight the war. And a lot of people came up to me afterwards and says, why did you let that guy speak? What were you thinking? Would Marcuse have been amongst them who said, in our own space, we should curate the conversation. We should repress the repressors. We should not allow these ideas to enter into our institution as we're trying to form it.
Well, I think it all depends on the context, and what Marcuse would say about a specific person and a specific organization, a specific instance is, I think, difficult to predict or anticipate, especially at a time and in a context that he wouldn't be familiar with. But I do think that there's an argument here for not just leaving all of our associations and organizations open to capture by the state or by corporations or by very, very powerful entities, which, if given the opportunity, will co-opt our organizational forms. Like, for instance, I make this critique of a lot of political parties that use primaries to pick their candidates. They're open to outside money. And because they're open to outside money, they have no way of saying no to somebody who wants to come in, who wants to join, who comes from outside, and may have intentions of turning that organization toward purposes that are not its original purpose, towards some kind of purpose which serves a corporate interest, serves the state. There have to be mechanisms when you have a society that's under attack from a very repressive system to have organizations that are committed to a particular point of view or to a particular perspective, not for the purposes of making all of these organizations think precisely the same thing, but precisely to preserve the possibility of pluralism. to preserve the possibility of different ways of thinking, different values, different ways of approaching that are not dictated by the state apparatus or by the ideological apparatuses in, say, an Althusserian sense that are very closely tied into that or have been subordinated to it. And I think that's what these theorists were really trying to do. It wasn't about crushing speech. It was about creating spaces where you have rules so that certain kinds of speech that would not be able to compete in the state-dominated space are able to survive and continue to be part of the discussion, continue to give people opportunities for other kinds of socialization. Because really the German idea of freedom is very much linked to a plurality of associations that can socialize people in diverse ways that are not all controlled by the state or merely branches of or appendages of the state. And for these guys, that was the thing that had increasingly effectively disappeared by the 60s. You no longer had organizations, associations that had that kind of autonomy or independence.
Okay, so in a context, so I'm a little confused because in a context where you no longer had those civil society institutions, which were autonomous, who was Marcuse calling upon to implement policies or practices of repressive, of against repressive tolerance, of repression? What was he trying to protect again if those things had actually disappeared? Or were there small pockets of resistance left that he was speaking to?
That would be my thought, that there were really, we're talking about small pockets of resistance that might still exist. And we might be, the idea of kind of the march through the institutions is this idea that these small pockets might be expanded or that they might be multiplied in some way, that you might grow them over time, but that you would need certain kinds of internal rules for governing the conversation in these clubs, in these associations, so that they could maintain their autonomy from the state.
Right. So once you talk about the long march of the institutions and trying to capture the university from these small pockets of civil society clubs and autonomous intellectuals, I start to think like Matt Taibbi again, like, oh, well, see, he is responsible for creating this woke madness in the universities, subverting the liberal foundation of universities by suggesting that rather than practice forms of free liberal toleration, that we embrace intolerance in certain respects around certain ideas. And then bringing that to the university where the scientific method and liberal discourse both demand that you simply cannot start with your assumptions. So how
I didn't deny Matt's point that this kind of view of how you should grow an organization can be operationalized by people who are not socialists or who are not of the left. Right. Certainly, it's a very effective way to start organizations in an otherwise very stultifying climate. Whatever kind of organization isn't dominant, you can try to produce that kind of organization by following this kind of approach, right? It's something that can be picked up and used in principle by almost any organization. And I think the thing that a lot of theorists like Marcuse struggled to anticipate was the degree to which in the 70s it would be organizations of the right that would be in position to implement this strategy and which would implement it most effectively. And they were able to do this because of the enormous amount of money that was backing the creation of right-wing organizations in the 70s, like the Heritage Foundation.
Right.
So, and now we have universities that we would not regard as socialist, we would not regard as left-wing. And at the time that we had this conversation, I was coming off of What's Left. And a lot of, for me, what What's Left was about was contesting this attempt to capture what it means to be left-wing, capture what it means to be socialist, and appendage it to this liberal administrative position that has nothing to do with helping workers, raising living standards, getting people things they need. And what bothered me about this is that in acting as if the people who had implemented this strategy were of the left, simply because they were Democrats, Matt was aiding and abetting the center and the right in pushing out socialism, pushing out any kind of authentic left-wing expression from the debate. And I don't necessarily think he was doing that on purpose, But there were a lot of people at that time who had kind of adopted the attitude that we have just no hope of contesting these terms. We have no hope of winning these debates. These words have all come to mean certain things now, and we just have to go along with it. And therefore, we might as well be right-coded and adopt, very, very right-wing aesthetics and terminology and conduct ourselves in that kind of way and try to win some kind of march through the associations or institutions by disguising ourselves as right-wingers, which in a way is a different version of an appropriation of that kind of thought.
Yeah, entryism is it is not an ideological position, but a tactic.
Right, it's a tactic.
Yeah. Okay, so in that, this moment was after Sanders had lost the nomination, right? That was settled when Taibbi was writing. And so I would ask you to consider that perhaps at that moment, I mean, the prospect for a left that could be independent of the center of the Democratic Party was gone. That the question of whether that could happen had been answered, and the answer was no.
Well, I was having a debate during that time with people. I was arguing that we should not support Joe Biden against Donald Trump. That if Joe Biden won, the country would move to the right because Joe Biden would be assumed to be of the left. The Democrats are always assumed to be left-wing. So whatever it is that they do, the left tends to get blamed for that. So for me, a very important part of trying to resist the direction that things were heading in that moment, insofar as I could, I recognize that using the term resist, I'm already acknowledging that I was fated to lose, was to say that there was a difference between the left and the Democrats, that there's a difference between socialism and liberalism as practiced in the United States today, and that we have to, in some way, insist on that difference. Otherwise, the choice of the left disappears from the menu entirely, and it just becomes the Democrats or Trump. And I felt that his intervention was part of this closing up of possibility, whether he intended it to be that or not.
Yeah.
And that it was obscuring something that had been lost.
Right. Let's talk. I want to bring up Angela Davis. I mean, I'm not sure if you're right or wrong about what. I mean, look, I had my own critique of Taibbi's article, and my critique of Taibbi's article was to say, listen, if you want to defend free speech and you want to defend liberal tolerance, you should, rather than pick out the pieces of Marcuse that you take issue with and where he may have made some fatal mistakes, you should take a look at the whole of his work and understand that the tradition he's in is precisely the tradition that wants to realize those values. Like that is a mistake to label, like I was with you. It was a mistake to label Marcuse or the Frankfurt School or Marxism itself as, definitionally anti-liberal or against liberal tolerance. And Taibbi granted you that when you were discussing this with him, right? He granted you that Marcuse would probably be on his side if he was around today. But I guess what I want to ask you about when it comes to Marcuse and the universities and the character of the left today, before and after Bernie Sanders, is Angela Davis. I had the experience of watching an Angela Davis panel event where she was she interviewed Grace Lee Boggs on stage in front of a live audience. And Grace Lee Boggs was part of the Forrest Johnson tendency, and I think she was with the Trotskyist sect Facing Reality. And she was someone who came from a tradition which I admired and agreed with. And I got to watch Angela Davis interview Grace Lee Boggs and it was done in the context of supporting the Democrats. I can't remember if it was like around the time of the Hillary Clinton Trump campaign or the Biden. I think it was Biden Trump, but Gracely Boggs ended up saying things like, "What before we can have a revolution in practice, we have to have a revolution in our hearts, change the kind of people that we are from the inside." That kind of thing. And it was maybe even a little worse than that. And it was like, basically we should be motivated to support the Democrats because the enemies of the Democrats have the wrong attitudes and the wrong kinds of hearts. And this is Angela Davis and Grace Lee Boggs, two major left Marxist figures from the New Left era of the 60s and 70s. So it seems to me as though the absorption of the left into the Democratic Party had already been accomplished, certainly by the 80s. And so do you think that there was a left, like maybe Jacobin or you and Amy at What's Left, that really had broken free of the Democrats or their ancillary organizations in their orbit?
Well, the trick was to break free of the Democrats without just tailing the Republicans instead. That was something that proved to me to be much harder for other people to do than I really thought it would be. I didn't think it would be so difficult to try to be a neutral and a third party independent kind of, I mean, not to start a third party, but you know what I mean? To not be caught up in either one and to have the option of playing the two off each other. I had a very pragmatic attitude at that time. I thought we should use both parties and that we should use both sides of cultural issues. And we should be agnostic on all sorts of provocative cultural questions and just do whatever is necessary to create a new economic consensus. I did not think that we should be adopting the opposite side of the culture war position, because if you do that, then you have no credible threat to support the Democrats. The credible threat of supporting the Democrats is just as valuable as the credible threat of supporting the Republicans from the kind of party capture strategy that at that time I was interested in doing. I'm no longer interested in that in the way that I was. But this issue about Angela Davis and the New Left, I think the reason that the New Left was so completely assimilated into the Democrats is that the class structure of the United States did not change in the way that leftists in the 50s and 60s thought it was going to change. They thought there was going to be very, very rapid technological growth that would lead to an explosion of automation, that would lead to it being more or less impossible for people to get work in blue-collar jobs. They thought that everybody was going to have a college degree, and that insofar as there would be a working class, it would be almost entirely a service sector, white-collar working class. And so they did not imagine that you would get into a prolonged cultural antagonism between college-educated people and traditional workers. They thought that the traditional worker was outmoded and could therefore be left behind. Because they overestimated the rate at which change would take place, they adopted a politics of a moment that never came. So they were always trying to be ahead. And they ended up, therefore, having a politics for a moment that never arrived and never really was appropriate for the actual material conditions that existed. And therefore, it just turned into a politics of the new class, politics of the professional class, politics of the white-collar people, and yet a politics of the college-educated people, the people who have college-educated mores. And it came to exclude the traditional worker as backward, necessarily backward, because this is the class that for them was meant to be eliminated by technology and automation. And therefore, why would you bother with trying to appeal to that class? It's always in the process of being eliminated. And therefore, demographically, it's fated to decline and fade, politically as well as economically. I think that's really the crux of the mistake of the New Left, is in always thinking that this moment is just around the corner, this moment when the working class, the traditional non-college educated working class, can be consigned to the dustbin of history. And the professional class, the college educated class, would be the only working class. And therefore, the professional class and the traditional working class would become the same class, and the politics of the college-educated worker would not be in any way in tension with the politics of workers writ large. That's something that the New Left is always looking for, always waiting for, always trying to insist has already happened, or is already about to happen, or is much closer to happening than anybody thinks. And it's a kind of a futurism that the New Left engages in, to use that term explicitly from my book. It's a kind of cope that they do where they believe in the future as a way of not having to deal with the actual material context that they face. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think really fatally went wrong. But it went wrong for very understandable reasons. All of these New Left theorists from the 60s who had grown up, 40, 50 years ago, had seen an incredible amount of technological change, an incredible amount that justified all of those retrofuturist visions from their point of view. And that's really what the New Left is. It's a kind of retrofuturism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When I think about the difference between the traditional blue-collar working class and the new class of college-educated professional workers, I tend to think, and this is something that has arisen, over the last 4 years and very strongly over the last year and a half, 2 years, that the traditional blue-collar worker has a firmer grip of what I consider to be left values and the revolutionary potential of modern society than the new class does. That the new class is submitted to the authority of the administrative state, has become, the right-wing meme of the non-player character is making more and more sense to me every day. And also, especially as I feel myself sucked into Twitter and start to become an NPC myself, reciting scripted lines to people. So I wonder about how, whether or not even in the 60s, this retrofuturism might have been a product of the ideology of the new class as it was developing, and of the dismissal of older forms of liberal bourgeois identity. What do you think about that question?
Well, I think that, from Adorno's point of view, the constitutive subjectivity has to be overcome immanently from within. So somehow the college-educated person who is increasingly administrative in outlook and tendencies, somehow that subject, if that is the subject that is to inherit the earth, that subject has to become revolutionary. And that's the thing that drives Adorno crazy, because he's looking at that subject in just the way that you are and going, how can this subject that is this way possibly be revolutionary? How can they possibly get what they need to get, given the degree to which they are already constituted by their relationship to the state? And so there's this incredible upset that I think that Adorno and Marcuse have both shared at this new class and its administrative, totally state-centric outlook. And yet they believe that demographically, this is the class that is destined at this point to become ever more widespread. This is the kind of subjectivity that is destined to become ever more dominant. So if there is still a way to do revolution, it has to be consistent with that kind of subject. And this is a point that I like to make a lot, that I think is consistent with the Frankfurt School point, which is the new kinds of subjectivity introduced by the 20th and 21st centuries have got to be compatible with our project, or our project will just never go anywhere.
What do you think those subjectivities are? Because it's not just the subjectivity of the new class and the administrative class and the college-educated class. And also, even within that, there is a lot more diversity and stratification than one originally thinks. So there's a big difference between someone who goes to a community college and gets a degree in nursing or even communications or business administration in order to get a job, and someone who goes to 4-year university and then goes on to get a MA or a PhD and is fully on board with the administrative society.
Yeah, and that's another consequence of the slowness of the change. It's allowed for stratification within the professions and for the professional class to be bifurcated into various strata. So I think that is another thing that is a consequence of how slow things actually did move in the back half of the 20th century.
Right. So would you say that there is still a kind of old-fashioned 19th century blue-collar, working-class, bourgeois subjectivity that is expressed in our politics today? That there is that working class that we wanted to that people wanted to organize and think that we should reach out to. Does that exist still anywhere?
I think there are moments where you might see overlaps between the kinds of subjects we have and that kind of consciousness that can give rise to an appearance of it still existing. But I think that by and large, we have different kinds of subjects from the 19th century. I think the millennial intervention was to look at the digital as a possibility of something new that goes beyond the new class subject of the 20th century, and to see if there was a way of using the digital to reunite these separated kinds of subjects, these different kinds of professional subjects, these different kinds of working class subjects, to find a way to bring them back around into the same kind of discussion that would cut across all those distinctions that had been created over that period of time. The failure of the millennial left is the failure to cut across all those distinctions and to cooperate over and around them. So when we say, okay, the millennial left has failed, that doesn't mean that now there's a kind of subject from the 19th century that's still ubiquitous that we can return to. It means that the attempt to resolve the problem of the 20th century that the millennial left embarked upon has also failed. It's just another layer of failure. It doesn't mean that there is some kind of return point.
Right. Now, when you say that they wanted to cut across all these different demographics and all the different stratifications, that almost sounds like a marketing problem. Which, by the way, it is like how corrupted my own thinking has become.
A lot of millennials think like that. A lot of them work in marketing, and a lot of think tanks now are about aesthetics. They're about how to market stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I've always felt that approaching the question of organizing as if it is a marketing problem is misguided, and I've always just sort of had that intuition that it's misguided. For me, because I create these videos and I write, I've always thought if I were to attempt to create an aesthetic that would appeal to what I think a truck driver would want, or what I think a farmer would be interested in, that I'm just going to look like a phony and a fraud, and it's going to be embarrassing. Like I just don't have that capacity to do that. Whereas if I do the very best that I can as an artist or as a writer myself, that I can just hope that it will have a universal appeal, that I don't have to cater to a particular aesthetic for Kansas is different from the aesthetic for New York, that there's a universal understanding that I can appeal to. That am I wrong about that, do you think, Benjamin?
I think you're probably right that if you tried to reach out to somebody you don't understand, it wouldn't work. But I also think that if you do what you think is cool, most people think that most things that other people think are cool are weird. Everybody thinks everybody's weird now. So I think that there is a constituency of people who share your sense of cool, share your style, share your aesthetic, and they like it and they gravitate toward it. But I wouldn't say that it would be universal. That's not to adopt like a postmodernist view and say that essentially we're all totally estranged or that there's no possibility of us ever cooperating. I think for historical reasons that are due to the way capitalism has developed, we are more separated, more atomized from each other than we used to be. And that this is an important fact for us.
When I was younger and I was writing science fiction more consistently, I was very interested in the early 20th century avant-garde traditions, and slowly became aware of the critiques of that tradition, and the way it became replaced by those kinds of artists, and the way those avant-garde traditions were heralded and privileged, gave way to privileging or focusing on multicultural forms of art that emphasized identity and difference in the 70s and 80s that really took hold.
Yeah,
And
there's this reified way of trying to do it, isn't there?
Yeah, and yes, and as if there are these firm cultural national identities that you can refer to that are usually based on their relationship to the colonizers or the empire, the imperialists, right? So they're the victims of the imperialists and the
Yeah, they think they can make a map of all of the different niches or scenes and they can understand all of them, but there's just way too many now. There's more than any one of us can grasp at once. No one of us can understand this culture now.
Well, I always thought of that as a political project that had happened within the arts rather than reflecting some innate or organic truth about how people understood art or what our social situation actually was. From my perspective, the avant-garde approach was the approach of artists who wanted to understand the reality of modernity, of our new forms of freedom and its limits and contradictions, and give expression to them in various ways, whether it was in surrealist ways or absurdist ways or through cubism, but it was always a way to try to express and then understand the modern society that we were in. And this multicultural turn attempted to erase the universality of modernity as if that didn't exist at all. And instead, we were within these very fixed and transhistorical communities, and the world could be understood on those terms.
Yes, the level of balkanization reached a point at which it could be reified and treated as natural and inevitable and just the way people are. The funny thing is there's so much against, naturalizing a single unitary view of people, but that is what in fact they have done.
Right. But I thought it was a political project more than a reflection of political balkanization or cultural balkanization that it had to do. But this may be a reflection of my white male identity, right? Because I thought, oh, they're coming for me. They don't want to have, they want to exclude me from the universality, and and by doing that, they're willing to give up on the universality. This is a confession that I'm making here. I should probably not say this in public, but there was, because it did come along with the drop of the avant-garde approach did come along with a diminishment of white male art. So it those two things came up together, and I couldn't really stand in defense of the whiteness and the maleness of these artists, right? So it was a tough position to be in. I'm not sure if you can help me clarify this moment a bit more, but do you think that what I was really facing was not an organic, but a real political, economic balkanization of culture rather than something that was the result of a political conspiracy within the arts, right?
Yeah, I would say there was this kind of moment where you could have this Althusserian view, in the 50s and 60s, and say that the state has taken over the culture and that all of these parts of the culture that were previously independent or composed of autonomous entities are now composed of entities that are either directly part of the state or indirectly subservient to the state through some concealed process. I think what then happened with the rise of the New Left was this attempt to challenge all of that, which in one sense succeeded and in another sense failed. So the sense in which it failed is, of course, it didn't produce any kind of left-wing move, any kind of socialism, any kind of change in the relations of production that would be of any kind of benefit to anybody who works, right? Mm-hmm. The sense in which it succeeded is that it did produce, through this kind of moving up in the institutions, conflicts and agonisms within institutions that used to be more unitary. So you still have this tons of interaction between the state proper and these cultural organizations, these associations, institutions, corporations. There's still a lot of interaction, but now both of these things have all kinds of balkanization points in them. They have all sorts of lines of conflict and agonism in them. And because people struggle to make sense of it in ideational terms, they often point at things that seem obvious, like physical characteristics, skin color, what you've got between your legs, this kind of stuff, which people always start pointing at the traits of bodies when they can't make sense of what's really going on. Really, you have particular ways of viewing the world that are gaining traction and steam under the cover of they're associated with the right kinds of bodies. It really doesn't have anything to do with the bodies. The language of we're helping the right kind of body is a cover for a particular set of ideas, but not in a conspiratorial way. I think it's a consequence of all of the different factions in society trying the tactics that are laid out originally for socialists. There's an enormous influence that the Marxist tradition has on all of the other political movements, and that Marxists come up with a lot of great tactics, which they all steal. And so then we see these tactics and we go, oh, who came up with this? It was the Marxists. It was them all along. But all of these tactics have been co-opted now and no longer have anything to do with the revolution or socialism or the workers, right? So there still needs, I think, to be an assertion of all of this stuff was invented to help people and then it was stolen from them. I think that needs to be said. And I think that people like Matt need to say that. They need to acknowledge that part. Because if you don't acknowledge that part, then it feels conspiratorial. It feels like there's some group of elites that are just, from start to finish have always dominated everything. But we used to actually matter. We used to be able to come up with stuff. We used to be able to do things. We used to be able to work on our political problems. And we can't do that anymore. And that's not natural. That's not inevitable. That's a consequence of how this thing has changed over the last 70 years.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.